I really was excited to join this panel, and Barry and I have talked about these challenges for years. As he mentioned, I came from local government where I started way back when in the city of Santa Monica. I worked in the nonprofit field. Now I work for a commercial real estate services firm, and we work a lot with the owners of buildings. I want to take a little bit of a different direction on some of the challenges for decarbonization and what I have learned already about working in commercial real estate and how those things kind of map together, because we need to solve these problems faster, and understanding the business that real estate is in can help us do that. So you can go to the next slide. So one of the things that we think about with our clients a lot is the technical decarbonization pathways. And this may be more familiar to a lot of the people on the call. Generally speaking, people follow a similar trajectory, right? So up at the far left, grid decarbonization, if our clients did nothing, they would still see a reduction in carbon emissions because electricity is getting cleaner over time, because it's cheaper than fossil fuel power. After that, we have operational changes that are low capital improvements, changing set points, changing schedules, turning off lights when they're not being used. After that, we look at when will I have to invest in new equipment? So that costs some money, it takes some time, takes some alignment, and there's embodied carbon considerations as well, and so on and so on. So there's generally a pecking order. Not every building will follow all of these. A lot of other considerations come into play, but we generally understand this sort of trajectory of how to approach decarbonization. And go to the next slide, please. The rest of my talk, actually, I want to shift gears completely because I think this audience probably knows a lot about that technical decarbonization pathway. I wanted to give a little bit more context for the commercial real estate market and how matching those technical strategies with what's going on in the market could be challenging or could create opportunities. So a lot is here on this slide, but generally speaking, what we're seeing broadly in the market is that office, this is what this is focused on here, is that offices, we think of 4 food groups in real estate: office, retail, industrial, and multifamily, and there's others and there's subcategories. But just for offices, it's a really troubling time. A lot of offices are worth much less than they were a few years ago. When tenants are renewing leases, you see at the bottom right, they're typically getting smaller amounts of space, and they're typically shortening the term that they're signing leases for. At the same time, there's a flight to quality. So when tenants are figuring out how much space they actually need, they're really going for high amenitization, lots of bells and whistles. Trophy properties are seeing record rents. So we're seeing this really big divergence between the best and the best and everybody else. And what does that mean? And what are the implications for how to decarbonize real estate? Next slide, please. So another thing that we think about here, the technical pathways I laid out in that first slide is really where a lot of the conversation has been. And I would say that's in kind of bucket 3. Do an audit at my building, figure out what are my levers for efficiency, for electrification, for renewables, figure out how much they cost, where can I get the money, what's the return on investment. But what we're actually trying to look at with our clients is, where do I start first? And a lot of that depends on where are the regulations going. Do tenants in your market value sustainability, which might be different in New York than Tallahassee than San Francisco? It might be different for different property types as well. So we're actually looking further upstream to figure out not just what the technical project list is, but where will this impact the value of a building, and how can we use that as a reason to prioritize some buildings over other buildings, knowing that we eventually have to get to all of them. Next slide, please. The other key thing that has been a challenge to get people's minds around is that on the ownership side, all of sustainability and green building in general, it's still relatively new in the property industry. Now, people understand LEED, it's been around for a while, but oftentimes the first time we have a conversation with owners, they'll assume that, well, wait a second, everything in downtown San Francisco, everything in New York has a LEED certification, so it must be low carbon, so it must be done, right? And when you look at the spread, you actually find that there's a lot of nuance there, right? And as we might know, there's difference between new construction certification and existing building certification. And even within buildings that are certified, it's not necessarily a guarantee that the building might meet what we consider low carbon performance. So here on the graph, you can see by LEED certification level for office buildings in New York, Class A office buildings, that dotted line is really the threshold for local law 97. And you can see that at every level of certification, even for non-certified buildings, there's still a pretty big spread. So even if you've already invested in something like LEED, which addresses many other things besides carbon and energy, you might still have work to do. So that's sometimes a challenge to get people to think about reinvesting in buildings where they may have already done a big project recently that didn't quite get them to the line. Next slide, please. So here's another place where I think this was relatively a learning curve for me when I came to JLL, and just understanding a bit about how property investment works. So one of the main takeaways for me, for all of you for this slide, is to say that different buildings are owned in different ways and are part of different strategies. And we can use that to our advantage when we're making the case for how and why to decarbonize. So on the top right table, what this outlines is 3 typical strategies that investors might pursue: core, value add, and opportunistic. Now, and we talk a lot about owners of buildings, but in reality, it's a lot more complicated how buildings are owned. They might be owned in a fund, they might be owned by themselves, they might be owned with a bunch of different limited partners and one general operating partner. But typically what a lot of real estate investors and owners do is they go out, they raise money from other capital sources, which are at the bottom, and I'll touch on in a second, for a certain strategy. So a core fund typically is considered a building as very stable. It's a trophy asset. The idea is that you're just collecting rent. It's a prime property in a prime location. You didn't go into it and buy it with the idea that you would have to spend a lot of money to fix it up. So you've already sold your investors on a strategy to just collect safe, stable income from a very high quality building that you believe will appreciate, but really the income source is coming a lot from that income, not so much from how much you think the building will appreciate over time. On the other end of the spectrum is opportunistic, where you might be buying a Class C or Class B building. Maybe it's a distress, maybe it needs a lot of work. So you're probably buying it for a lower price because you know you'll need to spend some money to fix it up to get tenants in there. Those different strategies might indicate different ways to approach decarbonization with an owner. If you bought an asset in the core fund and you plan not to spend too much money on it, it's going to be tougher to find additional sources of capital, maybe, to spend a lot of money to do, say, fuel switching. But knowing these things can help us make the case. On the bottom, what I've put in there is just the universe of different flavors of investors in real estate. And in some sense, all of these different types of companies and businesses can be considered owners. So even if one specific company is the named owner, they may have money and equity capital from all of these different types of entities: pension funds, private equity, banks, life insurance companies, and they all look for different types of return, different types of strategies. If you're a pension fund or a life insurance company, you're trying to collect stable income over time because you have to pay out liabilities. So really understanding the dynamics of ownership, the strategy, what goes on with investing in real estate, I think can help us make better cases and make more tailored approaches for how to decarbonize the real estate. Next slide, please. Another key concept to understand is the capital stack. And typically when buildings are acquired, they're not necessarily bought in cash. So there's a set, we refer to it as the stack because if something goes wrong, this is sort of the pecking order of how owners get repaid, or lenders get repaid, or investors get repaid. So at the bottom, you have senior debt that might come from a bank. The idea is I issue a loan just like a mortgage on your house. If things go wrong and someone defaults, they're the first to get paid back. Above that, people need higher rates of return to put in capital, whether it's mezz debt, preferred equity, or common equity. But the flip side of that is they're the first to lose money if anything goes wrong with the building. The other thing to understand here is that the loans and other relationships of these different types of capital all come with strings attached. So one example might be debt service coverage ratio. It's a ratio that says when I lend you money, if I'm a bank to buy this building, I want to know that the income you're getting from rent will cover the debt on the building. And there's a certain ratios they look to evaluate whether you get a loan. If your income falls below that, you may trigger a default on the loan, then you'd have an uncomfortable conversation with your lender. So just understanding when we're proposing different investments in decarbonization, how might those impact the ownership structure, the lenders, and other participants in a building? Because we think of it just as one single thing of one owner, and sometimes it can be a little bit different than that. Next slide, please. And I'll wrap up here with just sort of when we talk to clients about this, a lot of times we're thinking not just about the one building, but about their whole portfolio. And what we do here is we sort of triage. So you can see on this sort of matrix here is when will the building strand? If you look at the CREM curve, when will its carbon performance cross the acceptable threshold of CREM? And if you have ones at the top that never strand, great, they're achieving net zero carbon. We can track the assets under management and the percent of the portfolio that's in there. Other ones might strand a little bit sooner, but they only need, say, a light retrofit. So at the bottom, you see the type of retrofit we look at and how expensive is that. Does it require tenants to be out of space to do? That can be more disruptive, even more challenging than raising money to do some of the retrofits. At the bottom right, you can see if you really need to upgrade to a deep retrofit of the whole building and the building's trans soon, it's going to be very difficult to reposition for net zero carbon. And those ones are challenging for owners to figure out what to do with right now because they can't easily go out and get more capital to invest in the building. So I think that's my last slide. Open to Q&A later on, but I just want to present a little bit about real estate fundamentals because I think it can help this audience really tailor their programs towards owners and decarbonize faster. So thank you.